Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, you may have recognized that as Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. It is arguably the best-known poem written by an American poet. Some even say that you can take off the American. It's the best-known poem ever written. Standing at the fork in the road that Frost talks about, deciding which way to take. It's something that resonates with us all. We've all, like Frost, can think back to a point in our lives when we reached that fork in the road and we stood there wondering, which way should I take? And we looked and we contemplated and we finally made a choice. And thinking back to that choice that we made, we think, yeah, that really was crucial, wasn't it? It really made all the difference. We're going to read today of a couple that came to that fork in the road and had that choice to make. In the book of Ruth, we read the story of Ruth, who is a Moabitess, and she married an Israelite. You see, her husband was one that had moved to Moab. Oh, he and his family, his father and his mother, Naomi, and his brother, they had all left Israel because there was a famine. There was no food in the land and there was tough times there, so they went to Moab to try to find better economic times. And so there in Moab, this Israelite man married a Moabite, married Ruth. His brother married another Moabite, married a woman named Orpah. And they were living there for some 10 years, but as time went on, their father died. Not only that, the two sons died, so that Naomi was left without a husband, was left without two sons. All she had was two daughters-in-law. Then she got the news that things were going better back home in Israel, and she decided to go. And we read in Ruth chapter 1, verse 8, Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, We will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, Don't urge me to leave you or to return back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Ruth and Orpah found themselves at that fork in the road. Should they stay with their mother-in-law Naomi, stay with her, or should they go back home to their own mothers? You see, going back actually meant staying with the familiar. And staying with Naomi actually meant going to a new country and a new territory. Ruth and Orpah were contemplating this question, do I stay, do I go? They were asking that question that the rock band The Clash would ask some 3,000 years later. Should I stay or should I go? Sometime or another, we all find ourselves at a fork in the road. Ruth and Orpah are actually examples for us of the choices that we can make, going right or going left. See, Ruth chose the one path, and we know that Ruth's path led to glory. Ruth, going with Naomi, she ended up marrying a rich man back in Israel. And then she had a son. And her son, had another son who had another son. And Ruth became the great-grandmother to King David, the king of Israel. Not only that, the Messiah was born from her descendants. Ruth's story is recorded in the Bible, and she is one of the 4 women that is listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Ruth chose one path, and it led to glory. Orpah chose the other path, and that led to obscurity. We never hear another word about Orpah. When we stand at that fork in the road, we all want to choose Ruth's path and avoid Orpah's path. We all want to go the way that, is going to lead to greatness and wonderful things. We don't want to go the way that's going to lead to just nothingness. But how do we do that? How did Ruth know which way to go? How did Ruth know that she needed to stay with Naomi by going to a new country? After the tragedy of losing her husband and her 2 sons, Naomi had decided to return to her homeland. And Ruth and Orpah, her 2 daughters-in-law, had followed Naomi for a part of the way back toward Israel. And then it was at that point that Naomi tells them, you need to go back to your own homes, go back to your own mothers. Now it's kind of strange. Naomi packs up and starts on her way, and the 2 daughters-in-law are following along with her. Why did Naomi let them start the journey with her? It seems kind of odd, but it was probably just a social custom that you would naturally, the hosts of someone that was visiting, that you would follow the person for a little ways on their journey, seeing them off on their journey. It's kind of what my dad always did. And my mom used to get real frustrated with him because, we would have somebody over to the house to visit and have a nice visit there. And then it would come time for the people, we've got to go. And so they would say their goodbyes and everything, and they would head out the door. But my father would always follow them out the door. And he would always follow them to their car, and as they got in their car, then he would stand there at the car and spend another 30 minutes or so talking to them at the car. And my mom was like, they wanted to leave. You didn't let them leave. Oh, well. Ruth and Orpah follow Naomi a little bit. Naomi says, well, now it's time for you to go on back. Orpah goes back home, but Ruth insists on staying with Naomi. And she makes this tremendous statement that we read in verses 16 through 18. It's really a serious commitment that she's making here. She's saying, I'm going to stay with you no matter what. And literally, what Ruth is doing is she's giving up her nationality. She's saying, I'm no longer a Moabite. I'm going to become an Israelite. I'm going to give up the gods of Moab. I'm going to take the God of Israel. She's completely turning her back on her past. This statement of Ruth's that we have here in verses 16 through 18, it often gets used in marriage ceremonies because it's such a great statement of commitment of one person to another, of completely saying, I'm going to stay with you no matter what. And that's the commitment we should be making when we're getting married. But it's interesting that that commitment that we use in marriage ceremonies is actually of a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. How many of you out there would make this kind of a commitment to your mother-in-law? Yeah. Why on earth is Ruth making this commitment? Why on earth is she saying, no matter what, I'm sticking with you? There really is absolutely no logic to it at all. You see, Naomi, she explains in what we read there about how it makes no sense. The way things were in that day, if a man died having no child, then the rule was his brother was supposed to take his wife and have a child by her. And that would be a child credited to the man that had died. Well, that couldn't happen in this case because there were no other brothers. Both brothers had died, and so Naomi didn't have another son that Ruth could be the wife of. Not only that, Ruth says, it's too late for me. I'm not going to have any more kids. Even if I did, it'd be years before he'd be grown up and you could have him for a husband. So there's no way. It makes no sense. There's no way Ruth has any hopes of finding a husband through Naomi. Not only that, Naomi is a poor widow. She's at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. There's just absolutely no financial advantage to Ruth hooking her wagon to Naomi. Ruth instead can go back home. She would have a place there. She would have the possibility of finding another husband. She would have a possibility of a real life there. Ruth can go back to everything that's familiar. It makes absolutely no logical sense for Ruth to follow Naomi. So what is it that could have been motivating her? What was it that made Ruth make this strong commitment that says, hey, no matter what, I don't care, I'm sticking with you? Did Ruth see Naomi's faith and think, I want that? Well, maybe. Although indications are that Naomi wasn't really displaying great faith. Naomi and her husband had left Israel in a time of difficulty. They weren't faithful to stick it out and faithful in believing that God could provide for them there. They headed off for greener pastures. Not only that, their two sons had married Moabite women. It was forbidden for an Israelite to marry a Moabite. They weren't supposed to do that. And so they weren't exactly following the law. They weren't staying with their faith exactly as they should have. So I don't think that Naomi was displaying great faith that would have attracted Ruth. What was it that was motivating her? Well, maybe Ruth felt sorry for Naomi. Ruth saw the depression that Naomi had fallen into. The bitterness of her life. She had lost her husband and her two sons. I mean, her whole world had crashed in on her. She had nothing. Maybe Ruth felt sorry for her and said, boy, somebody's got to stick with Naomi, because if they don't, I mean, she doesn't have a prayer. Well, maybe it was with doubt, but we don't know that either. Was Ruth just trying to get away from her previous life? Was things bad for her in Moab? And so she was like, I'll take anything. We don't know. Could have been any of those things. All that we can really say is that Ruth was determined to stay with Naomi, no matter what. As we consider that fork in the road, as we consider the two paths, as we consider Ruth and Orpah, they're examples of the paths that we can take. And when we think about it, we think, well, you know what? Orpah is more the one we should admire. Orpah's more the one that we should follow. Orpah's the better example, isn't she? You see, Naomi equally praised both of her daughters-in-law. Nothing suggests that Orpah was any less of a good person than Ruth was. Her character is not impugned at all. Naomi seems to consider both of her daughters-in-law as fine women. Oprah Winfrey's parents even thought Orpah was such a good character that they named their daughter after her. They just got the letters mixed up a little bit. Orpah, from what we see here, she's independent. She's self-sufficient. She's logical. Orpah seems pretty admirable character. Contrast that with Ruth. Ruth is clingy. Ruth is needy. She's irrational. She's emotional. She's risking her whole future on a plan that has absolutely no hope of success. And yet Ruth's is the path that turns out to be the one to glory and not obscurity. So is the Scripture telling us that the choice that you make, the path that you choose when you're at that fork in the road, the crazy path is the right one? To go with God means throwing all reason and all caution to the wind and doing what is totally illogical? Well, we could look at the Apostle Paul, who writes that we preach Christ crucified, which is foolishness to the Gentiles. He's saying, our faith is just foolishness in many ways. So the right path is the crazy path? Well, I don't think so. Jesus also told parables that encouraged wisdom, that encouraged logical thinking, that encouraged considering all of the factors and making a wise and informed choice. He told the story of a builder that was wise enough to build on the rock instead of on the sand. He told the story of one that was building a tower and says, as you're setting out to build that tower, you need to count the cost. You need to think through it all and determine, well, if I've got enough that I'm going to be able to finish it. Because if you can't finish it, well, then you become a laughingstock. So Jesus didn't see a total disconnect between faith and reason. No, faith and reason are not mortal enemies. In order to follow our faith, it doesn't mean we have to throw out all kinds of logic. It doesn't mean we have to completely ignore any common sense and just do what's absolutely crazy. God gave us a brain, and He expects us to use it. No, the godly decision is not just simply the crazy decision. So how did Ruth choose? How did she know what to do? How did she know, I've got to stay with Naomi? Most people, considering the crossroads that Ruth and Orpah found themselves at, most people would choose the way Orpah did. It was the sensible choice. And considering Ruth, you would think, well, this is what she should have done. I mean, logic tells her that she should go back home. She doesn't have any prospects in Israel. She's got prospects back in Moab, back at home. Not only that, Orpah sets the example for her. Orpah goes on back. So here's somebody else that had the same choices, and this is what they chose. Not only that, Naomi is instructing her and telling her, you need to go back home. So everything is telling Ruth, go back. But Ruth chose the road less traveled. Is that what we should do? Choose the less popular route? Well, Jesus did say, wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. God's way is often the less popular way. Like a politician that chooses his position by the polls, is the Scripture telling us, well, we should basically do the same thing, except, we hold our finger to the wind and, okay, which way is it going? And then do the opposite? Well, this is certainly not what the Bible teaches. See, we don't choose against the popular opinion just because it's the popular opinion. Scripture calls us to love and obey God. Scripture calls us to follow Him no matter what. Now, that often means that we hold unpopular positions. That often means we're left in the minority. That often means we're swimming against the current. But it's not determined by that. It's determined by what God tells us to do. God tells us the correct path, and we must follow that. So how did Ruth know what to pick? How did she know? If she wasn't doing something crazy, just doing the nuttiest thing possible, or if she wasn't just going against the grain, doing the most, unpopular and irrational thing possible, then how did she know what to choose? I had a professor in college who actually was a friend with Robert Frost. And he would always gush about Robert Frost and tell us about him. And he told us that his probably most famous poem, The Road Not Taken, is probably, again, the best known poem out there that most everybody has at least heard a little bit about or knows a phrase or two from it. He says, even though it is his best known and best loved poem, it's probably his most misinterpreted poem. That everybody gets it wrong. See, everybody thinks that the road not taken is about, coming to that crossroads and choosing a path and, wow, the difference that is made. And, oh boy, did I do great in choosing the road less traveled. I was so smart in going the way that, that not everybody else was going. I went against the grain and wow, it turned out great. Everybody thinks that's what the poem is saying, but that's not really it. You see, Frost calls it the road less traveled, but he really doesn't know that. From the poem, it says the two ways were worn about the same. Frost stands there at the crossroads, and, he can't say that, a lot of people have gone this way and not so many have gone that way. No, he says they're worn about the same amount of traffic has traveled both ways. Again, Frost says, both equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Basically saying, it's the same. Nobody has gone either way today. Nobody else has headed either direction. You see, Frost doesn't go against the grain and choose what fewer before him had chosen. He just chooses one way. And Frost doesn't make an insane choice. He said they were both equally inviting. Each way looked pretty good. He just chooses one way. And he supposes that one day he'll look back on that choice and he'll say, it made all the difference. But here's the rub. What difference? Was it good or was it bad? We don't know. Frost doesn't say. All he can say is that he knows that was a crucial decision that has affected everything that has followed after in his life. He doesn't know what taking the other path would have led to. And that's something we can all relate to. That may be why the poem resonates with us so much. We can look back in hindsight and see forks in the road that have led us on the course for our lives. And we like to tell ourselves that our choice at that time has made all the difference for the better. But in reality, And this is what Frost is getting at with his poem. We really don't know what our lives would have been had we chosen the other path. We don't know if the difference that choosing the path we did, if that difference was for the better or for the worse. You see, for all Frost could see standing at the fork was that the paths were equal. And that's the way it looks to us many times. Is that where God leaves us? Standing at the fork in the road where we know our decision is crucial. I mean, what way I choose to go is going to determine my course for years to come. We know the decision is crucial, and yet we have no way of judging the paths. If that's what God's doing to us, He's being rather cruel. Well, sometimes we stand at that fork in the road, and God does give us clear direction. God does put a signpost there pointing one direction, saying, do not go this way and do go this way. The boy standing in the candy aisle looking at the Snickers bar longingly and notices that the clerk's back is turned. He stands at that fork in the road. Will he pocket the chocolate bar or not? At that point, hopefully the boy will remember the 8th commandment that he learned in Sunday school. Thou shalt not steal. See, God gives clear direction as to which way to turn at that point. When the choices we make are between trusting God or falling to our own temptations, God always has a clear word about right and wrong. He always is saying, no, take this path, not that one. Not only does God define the wrong path, He provides the choice of a right path. The Apostle Paul again writes, but when you are tempted, He, that's God, will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. Basically, Paul is saying God's always going to give you that other option. When you've got the temptation to go this one direction that is going to lead into destruction, that's going to lead into disobedience and leading away from God, God's always going to give you an option and say, no, look, there's another fork in the road. And you can turn and you can take that other fork. But not all our forks in the road are like that. Many of our forks in the road don't have that component to them. Many of our forks are just not a choice between right and wrong, not a choice between good and evil, not a choice between following God and following after our own desires. No. Many of our forks in the road are choices between one good option and another good option. And at those points, we may lack clear direction from God. God doesn't give us an absolute this way, not that way, because there isn't an absolute there. There isn't one way that's right and the other that's wrong. It's not like stealing the candy bar. One path is not leading toward punishment and sin. You see, when we read the story of Ruth and Orpah, we jump to the conclusion that, well, this is a life and death decision. Well, yeah, it did completely change both of their lives, but it wasn't a choice between life and death. You see, we only make that judgment based on what we know followed. We only know that because, well, Orpah went off and we don't know nothing about her. But Ruth, wow! I mean, Ruth became a hero of the faith. Ruth gave birth to, the Messiah, through the King David, all of that came through Ruth. But you see, at that moment, as Ruth and Orpah stood at that fork in the road, there was nothing to tell them where their choices might lead. And in fact, all indications were that going back was the only reasonable thing to do. Orpah chose one path, and Ruth chose the other. Orpah chose the sensible way, the reasonable, the logical. Ruth chose the noble, sticking with her poor mother-in-law. But interestingly, Scripture does not condemn Orpah's decision. Scripture doesn't tell us that Orpah did something bad. It just doesn't tell us anything about what happened to her because it's not part of salvation history. She's not in the line that leads to Jesus, and so that's not what the Bible is concerned with. The Bible is telling us about salvation in Jesus Christ, and He brought it about partly through Ruth. So we just don't hear anything more about Orpah. It doesn't mean that Orpah's life was bad, or that Orpah's life was wrong, or that Orpah's life was unsuccessful. You see, what the Bible doesn't tell us is probably that Orpah went home, and instead of looking for a husband, she decided, you know what, I'm going to build a media empire. I am going to become one of the richest, most powerful, most influential women in all of Moab. What the Bible and history doesn't tell us is that Orpah used those riches and that media empire that she had built up in order to completely transform the transportation system in all of Moab. You get a chariot, and you get a chariot, and you get a chariot. Ultimately, the reason Ruth chose to stay with Naomi and go to Israel was God had a plan. Ruth couldn't have known any of that. She didn't. She couldn't have known, standing there at the fork in the road, say, you know what, Naomi, I'm going with you so that I can marry a rich man back in Israel, and I can have a son, and then my great-grandson can become king, and then my great-great-great-great-great-great-great, and a bunch more greats-grandson becomes the Messiah and saves the whole world. Ruth didn't know any of that, standing at the fork. Ruth chose to stay with Naomi because something within her pushed her to defy logic. And I think that something was God. So how do you choose which fork in the road to take? Well, first you got to decide what kind of fork you're standing at. Is this a fork in the road between obedience and disobedience? Is this a fork in between faith and doubt? Is this a fork in which the Scripture clearly teaches one way is right and the other is wrong? Is one of these choices sinful? If that's not the case, if neither of the choices is sinful in and of itself, then you're kind of free to choose either fork. And I would say you should probably go with the more logical one. You should go with the more reasonable choice. God gave you a mind and gave you some powers to think it through, and so you ought to go that way. Unless, like Ruth, God places it on your heart. And He gives you that gut feeling deep within, just something you just can't describe, something you can't explain, but somehow you know what, it makes no sense, but I think I ought to be going this way. If God does that to you at that fork in the road, then you should take the road less traveled. Many years ago, I stood at a fork in the road. I was going to college, and I had the choice between University of Missouri and St. Louis or Houston Baptist University. I'd been accepted both places. UMSL was the sensible choice. Made sense. I had a scholarship there. I could live at home. Wouldn't have to spend money, living in a dorm. I could continue serving in the church I was already working at, teaching the youth. UMSL was the sensible choice. HBU was crazy. It made no sense at all. I'd never been to Texas before. I knew no one there. I had no money to go there. I had no promise of getting on the gymnastics team, even though that was my dream. There was nothing about going there that made any sense. And, well, on top of that, my parents were completely against it. Now, was UMSL a bad choice? No, it wasn't. Things could have worked out quite well for me at UMSL. I could have done very well. I had friends that went to UMSL and then ended up in ministry and are pastors today. So, I could have been just like them. But I felt God directed me to HBU. So I went to Houston. And living there in Houston, it grew my faith as I had to trust God for everything in a completely foreign environment and not having the funds really to make it. I trusted God, and God provided a scholarship. And God fulfilled my dreams of competing in the NCAA, and God opened up ministry opportunities to travel to other countries and to serve with Athletes in Action. Two roads diverged in my life, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference.